Good morning, everyone. It's nice to see you all today. Thank you for making time in what we know is a very busy schedule for you folks to join us this morning here at Sullivan Renaissance for our Municipal Forum. We like to do this occasionally, get everyone together and hear from folks from outside of Sullivan County, especially, and some of the things that are happening regionally and nationally. I don't think we've ventured into globally yet, but I can share a story about piles of what's it called, what you pave roads with? Macadam, left on the sides of the road for filling potholes. A very innovative approach they use in some other countries. We can talk about that another time. So I'm Denise Frangipani with Sullivan Renaissance, and we have a great program for you this morning. And so to kick it off, I'm going to hand things over to Helen Budrock, our Assistant Director and Community Planner, who most of you know and I'm sure adore. Helen?
Should have planned this so we were on the same side of the stage, right? So again, thank you for coming. We have two wonderful speakers here today. You have the bios in front of you, so I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on their background, but we have Bryan Ross from the Center for Active Design, and we also have Karen Black from May 8th Consulting. So Bryan is going to go on first. I'll just do a quick introduction. Again, Bryan is with the Center for Active Design. He's a planner like myself. He works with communities, focusing on how you can integrate design into projects that help benefit health. But one of the exciting things that he's been working on that he gave us a little sneak peek of at our annual conference back in the spring is some groundbreaking research that the Center for Active Design has done that actually can prove that people who live in well-maintained, well-cared-for public spaces in their communities actually have more confidence in their local government, and they vote more, and they're more actively involved in civic life. So we thought we would have him come and share some of that research, and we'll have a little Q&A, and then Karen will come up and talk about code enforcement. So, Bryan?
Cool, thank you very much. Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you again for coming, and to the session organizers. I'm glad to be back. As Helen mentioned, I was up here in April and shared kind of the preview of what was about to be launched as far as our guidelines. And so I'm excited to come back and kind of report out that they are now fresh off the presses and available for anyone to review for free. And today I just want to have like basically an introduction to what they are, and also provide some compelling research and kind of make connections for you all in the communities up here in Sullivan County. So a little bit about me. As Helen mentioned, I am a planner, urban planner in background, so that is obviously my bias and my perspective. But I represent the Center for Active Design, which is a nonprofit organization based in New York City, and we are really born out of New York City's government. It was a multi-angled perspective that kind of brought us the notion of active design, which I'll go into in a minute. But on staff, we have planners, architects, real estate, public health researchers, social scientists, and so we really have this convergence of expertise that tries to translate like kind of the latest research around holistic health, and our goal is to really transform and drive design and development practice to respond to that research. So the kind of beauty here is that you don't necessarily need to know what active design is from a definition standpoint to really understand how it impacts you. Just by a show of hands, who's familiar with the term active design? Okay, good. So maybe about 20% of the room. Active design and holistic design is really intuitive. Looking at this as an example, a schoolyard in Brooklyn, you can see here that there's obviously very little welcoming you into the space. It's gated, it's pure asphalt. There's not a lot of greenery, but this, by definition, is a playground in New York City. But imagine what you can do with a little paint, some greenery, and really a little wherewithal, right? This is obviously a much more welcoming space, a space that will be more used, more enticing, and is really a beautification of a public asset. So I really want to talk about, just for a few minutes, because I'm here today to really talk about the Assembly Civic Design Guidelines, but I need to kind of set the basis and give you a primer for who we are as an organization and kind of our roots. And our roots were really born out of the obesity crisis. And so if you're looking at these maps, starting in like the 80s and 90s and through even today, there's this really major obesity crisis taking afoot in the public health world. So as you look from 1990 to 2014, the rates are just exponentially increasing. So decade over decade, we realize there's really a troubling trend taking place. And for the longest time, we wanted to, as a society, attribute that crisis to individual choice, to poor behavior, essentially. But looking at kind of the state of the built environment, we started to realize that there was really kind of a systemic problem, kind of taking obesity and keeping it a hold. So we really want to, as an organization, recognize that chronic disease such as obesity, heart disease, stroke, are really major causes of death in the world. 7 out of 10 deaths in the US, and nearly 60% worldwide. And it has replaced smoking as the leading cause of preventable death in the world. And I think this last kind of statistic is really compelling and kind of is a mandate for us all to act. That if things don't change, this is the first generation projected to have a shorter lifespan than their parents. And just looking at the photos on the right, I like to point out that, why would you ever be active? Why would you ever take the stairs if there's always an escalator available? Why would you ever walk down this street if there's not a meaningful place for you to walk, a safe, meaningful walk if you're relegated to this dirt path to the right? So, I think what this is pointing out is that this is really a condition of the built environment. And using New York City as an example, here we see that, in Manhattan, using the color coding, light meaning that the obesity rates are lower than the darker reds, this is directly tied to disparities in the way the physical environment is built and designed. And importantly, as we were an organization born out of fighting obesity and chronic disease, what we've recognized is that public health literature and research has really evolved to incorporate the understanding that design can also impact other indicators and measures of health. And so what we like to talk about is holistic health. And that's kind of the convergence of mental, social, and physical health, what we like to call quality of life. And I want to point out this rather dated, actually, World Health Organization definition of quality of life and holistic health. And it is this complete physical, mental, and social well-being, and not just the absence of disease or infirmity. And what this is saying, it's about allowing people to live their best lives and to really thrive in their communities. And I think this is particularly important for any designers in the room. Just also another show of hands. Do we have any designers or architects or anyone who oversees departments in local government? Okay, one hand. So I'm going to be looking at you for the rest of the presentations because you're the definite audience for me at the moment. So starting with the Active Design Guidelines 2010, we've really started to codify the translation of research and design practice, working with national partners, including the Urban Land Institute. We also operate Fitwell, which is the leading healthy building certification system globally. And that has kind of led us to the story that is the Assembly Civic Design Guidelines, which is what I'm here today to discuss. This is a really groundbreaking, pioneering body of work connecting what we call civic life, civic health, civic engagement to the built environment. So I'm excited to kind of dive into this. I am going to run through the guidelines. It's a lot of information, and I will, of course, provide you with a link at the end to download it, and I'm going to leave a few copies behind. But this is a really dense set of guidelines backed by research, and as we'll talk about, it was a 4-year effort, and we're thrilled to share it with you guys today. So why do we focus on civic life? What is civic life? So for decades, communities have really been grappling with these diminishing levels of trust, participation, stewardship, and local voting. We know that communities are more economically segregated, social isolation is on the rise, there's all these disparities in the investments in communities, and at lockstep with that, there's decrease in trust in institutions and in the media. So the kind of the environment that is civic life and civic engagement is really kind of in a point of turmoil. And so that's why we wanted to focus on it. And this is just kind of a scribble out of kind of the conditions of a kind of lackluster community where there's isolation, election polls are forever away. There's litter, there's dilapidation, there's blight, there's not a lot of care and input into the public realm. But we are also seeing that, interestingly, communities that have higher percentages of civic life, civic engagement, turnout, are thriving. And so we've drawn some conclusions. People are generally healthier. Active participation in community organizations is associated with lower mortality rates and improved physical and mental health. Crime is lower in communities where participants are, or where communities are much more active. People turn out to vote, volunteer, join local organizations, and crime rates are interestingly lower. And economic outcomes are much more prosperous in these communities. Communities with engaged residents often have less inequality, higher per capita incomes, and better long-term economic prospects. So that's why we feel like this is a real moment in time to shift the conversation over to civic life and say, hey, there are things that we know we can do that are evidence-backed to support thriving civic life in communities. And I like to use this as an example. This is actually from Queens, New York, in a really, really suburban area of Queens. This is a public asset. This is a library. You might not know that. It does say Queens Library, Glen Oaks. But this is kind of a prototypical mid-century library in a lot of communities. I can recognize this from my own town growing up in North Carolina. So let's consider this the before. We don't really see well-maintained greenery. There is a bit of mystery as to what's going on, not exactly a transparent facade. There's not really any public seating available. There's really no welcoming messaging going on. And what we've come to realize is that is associated with a decrease in civic trust. Maintained greenery, poorly maintained greenery, is directly attributable to an 11% decrease in civic trust, according to our research. Now, this is the before, and I want to now turn to the after. So here we see greenery. We have public seating available. We have signage. We have the word search kind of beaconing as public art. What you can't see to the right of the frame is that there's actually a little courtyard that's been developed. It actually provides light into the sunken stacks below. There's a bus stop, adequate bike parking, and it's really become a symbolic gathering space for the community. And of course, that has outcomes, according to our civic life indicators: an 8% increase in civic trust and a 5% increase in community pride, according to our research. And I kind of want to read this quote out loud because I think it's pretty compelling as far as a person who visits the library. But the new library is so bright and spacious, it makes people want to spend time there. More than ever, it's a community hub for the neighborhood. And I think that's kind of what this is all about, is bringing neighbors together in a time of isolation and disinterest. And if we can create spaces, both buildings and public spaces, that can provide people of different backgrounds coming together, having a conversation, decreasing barriers, that's really the impetus of our work, the ethos of our work. Also, we know that public space is a powerful tool for overcoming inequity. There is a growing body of research that suggests that green space may have especially positive impacts for lower income urban communities. We know that oftentimes public space is often the de facto only space in low income communities. So it's important to recognize that public space is a powerful tool for addressing the public life issues of the day. I want to introduce you to the Assembly research process. This, as I said, was over 4 years in the making. We analyzed, as we do as an organization, over 200 studies on the topic, and what we did in that process was kind of collate all of the academic research, come up with a lit review, and analyze and identify the areas where we could, with our own research, fill in gaps. So we did original research and field research, and today's findings are really going to shed some light on what we found. We also incorporated over 50 cities' perspectives through case studies, interviews, and also the field research itself. We pioneered the Assembly Civic Engagement Survey, which was a first of its kind 5,000 plus survey sample directly asking questions connecting the built environment to our civic life indicators. And we brought together on a yearly basis a set of expert advisors spanning social sciences, marketing, planning, architecture, management, operations, building management. and community leaders and civic organization leaders. So this was really like a multidisciplinary, diverse perspective around the issue. And I kind of want to pause here for a second and say that from the outset, we didn't know exactly what we meant by civic life. It's kind of a nebulous term. How do you define civic life? And so it was really important in the first year to bring these leaders together, this advisory council together, to say, how do we define civic life? Because everyone from their different practice has a slight different bent on what that means. And so what we realized and developed were these 4 civic life indicators: trust and appreciation. Do you trust your neighbors and your community leaders? And do you have a sense of pride in your community? Do you have a strong sense of appreciation for your community? Do you take that appreciation and do you participate in public life? Are you compelled to live out in the open, attending events and regularly interacting with neighbors? Do you take that a step further? Are you taking a sense of ownership in your community? Do you pick up trash when you see someone else litters? Do you volunteer? Do you exercise a dialogue with your community leaders? Are you invested in your community? And lastly, we wanted to start to tick at what it took to kind of complete that loop and recognize that the people in power are the people who make decisions, and therefore, do you get out and vote? Also, side note, today is National Registration Day, Voter Registration Day, and in New York State, you can register to vote up until October 12th. So just a little plug in case anyone in the room isn't registered. So what we have here is a set of guidelines out of that process. Because once we had those research parameters, we could really begin investigating and organizing all of that work into a set of codified guidelines. And so today's talk is really going to provide a very high-level overview, as I mentioned. And we're going to share some emerging research, some pioneering research from this initiative. Also, I want to land a few times on some exemplary case studies from projects across the country that represent replicable ideas for any community in the country and truly in the world. And so we want to celebrate some of the work already going on the ground and hopefully inspire all of you in the room to adopt any and all of these ideas and incorporate it into your work. For those of you who do end up downloading the guidelines or getting a hard copy, I want to orient you to how they work. So there are 8 kind of chapters in which there are multiple guidelines. Within each, there's research connection to civic life. There's a strength of evidence key, basically informing the reader as to how strong the evidence is backing up that guideline, anywhere from emerging or really solid research. We provide research details. We provide case studies and examples and strategies. So this is really a useful toolbook. And I think what's probably most interesting for anyone in the room that is working on a public project or even a private project is that at the very end there's a checklist where you can go down and just, it's our goal that all of these get checked off, but that's not always practical. But using this as a really friendly tool to kind of assess how your project can make a mark on this. And I also know that we're going to end with some Q&A today, so I thought I'd posit some questions for you all to kind of consider as we roll through these guidelines. But basically, what of these topics have direct resonance within your own work? Can you think of a local project going on today in Sullivan County that might benefit from any one of these guidelines that I am going to discuss? And lastly, particularly, how can we elevate equity and inclusion in the design of public spaces in Sullivan County? And I think these are really good questions, but we'll be open to any and all questions after this. Any questions thus far? Cool. So the first guideline is enhanced community connections, and this is really at the core of our work to really connect people to one another by modes other than the personal vehicle. And we definitely want to elevate pedestrians in this work. We also want to elevate alternative transportation choices, and we want to diversify land uses because we know that has a direct impact on civic life. So for example, our research indicates, and this is coming from our vast 26-city survey, that bike lanes in a community can increase civic trust by 6%, participation by 5%, stewardship by 4%, and voting by 4%. And I know these may not be that interesting of percentages, but taken at scale, at population scale, that's pretty powerful in communities of 10, 20, 30, 40,000 people and up. So, you're able to move the marker on some of this. And so taking an example, from Charlotte, this is a rail trail that was just kind of unused land next to the rail corridor, the new light rail in Charlotte. And there was this notion that people could come together, contribute public art. It could become this place that elevated the visibility of the light rail itself, but also kind of complemented the formal pedestrian network. And I am from Charlotte, and I can attest to the fact that that formal pedestrian network isn't all that fantastic. And so any ways to address connectivity by bike, and by pedestrian stance is really compelling. So what this did was bring together neighbors from all the different neighborhoods of the rail trail and provide them with a place to come together. Here we are connecting different incomes, different races in this kind of incredible public space. And of course, we know that public art is a really powerful way of symbolizing a community's desires and also giving voice to community. Our second is to prioritize maintenance. And I cannot echo enough that this came up again and again and again and again in our research. The necessary priority that is putting maintenance first. It's one thing to build a lovely project and then have it deteriorate. That can have negative consequences. So if you're going to embark on a public realm or public building improvement plan or design scheme, you need to also have a solid maintenance and operations plan in place. Otherwise, it will negate the success of the project. And it came up not only in our research, but also in all the discussions with all the different cities, in our advisory council. It just was a theme that was always at the top. But in the guidelines in this chapter, we talk about mitigating litter. We want to clean up vacant lots, and I know there's going to be some discussion later today about lots and blight and the importance of kind of controlling those outcomes. And we also, in the chapters, discuss kind of allocating resources and focusing on investing in what matters the most, because public perception of public space differs between different amenities. So if you're going to invest money and you're going to allocate wisely, it's good to have some kind of research backing that understands where to invest your resources. I want to point out the fact that litter can absolutely drain civic trust. Here we see that, for those of you who can't see in the back, 10% decrease in civic trust, in community pride, in trust in local government, in belief that community members care about one another, 5% decrease in trust in police, and a 4% decrease in trust in local government to do what's right. So litter can really ruin any kind of progress made in a community's efforts to beautify itself. But if there's not adequate trash collection and maintenance considerations, it can really have this draining effect. And I think it's important to remember that as you use the guidelines or look at the guidelines, what is really helpful is to understand that there's this importance of maintaining what matters most and understanding that there's a minimum maintenance required. And we're going to explore that in the next section. And looking to Philadelphia's Parks Department and the Fairmount Park Conservancy, we noticed that there's a really incredible story happening there where they bring together volunteers on a regular basis, and they're called Friends of the Parks Department. And they come together annually, twice annually actually, to volunteer, but it's also more of a celebration. So it's an event and a stewardship model, and it's wildly successful, and it's detailed in a Stories from the Field element in the back of the book. So I encourage everyone to take a look. But basically, over 4,000 people come out twice a year and pitch in to bag leaves, paint benches, and do all kinds of other kind of simple work, but work that is often overlooked because there just isn't the money or the hands to do it. Our third is to incorporate nature. And like maintenance, nature is really seen again and again in our research as profoundly impacting health, holistic health. It invites social interaction, it can mitigate against poor mental health, and it can really encourage physical activity. Who doesn't want to be outside? So in this section of the book, we talk about improving the streetscape with trees and plantings, beautifying with streets and, with trees and plantings. We want to encourage community gardening as a way of bringing people together, also really encouraging and exposing people to healthy food choices, and also celebrating the unique natural assets that make communities kind of themselves. Here we are in Sullivan County in an absolutely stunning part of the nation. So making that a much more known entity and element of the everyday life, I think is really powerful. So looking to maintenance and greenery as a connection, what this graphic describes is that there is a baseline of standard maintenance required in order to improve civic trust. So basically what this is telling you is poorly maintained greenery is worse than no greenery at all. So you are better off having a patch of dirt than you are weeds and overgrown brush. So we know that very well maintained greenery can increase trust by 8%, but the converse is true as well. 11% decrease in civic trust if it's not well maintained. So the importance here is to definitely maintain what you have. Some other sample strategies in this section include increasing street trees and really requiring plantings in all new developments, and also weaving in other natural elements, because access to nature doesn't necessarily just mean trees and flowers. It also means natural elements such as like craggy rocks, waterfront access, and other natural features. And taking an example from San Jose, California, Vegilution is this fantastic organization that kind of squats in public space and plants community gardens. And I can recall now that the last time I was here, I was taking a walk around Liberty, and there were at least one community garden, if not a couple, as I recall. So it's nice to see that some of these ideas are already being adopted locally. But there's a real powerful tool in just planting crops and bringing people together and harvesting that food as a way of kind of creating this social activity. Our fourth is to celebrate community identity. And what we talk about in this section of the book is using local arts to really inspire and engage community members. We want to connect diverse local cultures, especially in this time of kind of disenfranchisement and disinterest in social connection. And we want to preserve and repurpose historic assets because we know that those can really become beacons of kind of symbols of the communities. And we want to showcase local food. Again, food is really an interesting topic for us to address and kind of a pioneering topic, one that's really emerging in research. But everyone eats and everyone likes to eat together. So I think it's a really kind of interesting notion that we present. But looking to some of the research in access to arts and culture, we know that people who report high levels of access to arts and culture also score higher on civic life outcomes. So they're 20% more likely to rate local leaders as effective if they have a regular roster of programs and events available to them. There's also an increase in participation of 14% and stewardship. If you have access to arts and culture, you are more inclined to donate to local organizations. And if you have access to arts and culture, you are more inclined by 14% to attend local events. So it's kind of chicken and egg. If there's something available for you to attend, you're more likely to attend it. And that really starts to kind of create this cycle of participation in public life. Taking a cue from Charlotte, this is actually an example of a project where nothing existed before, but by putting up a sculpture that was built by the community and putting around some benches, there became this focal point and a connecting gathering space for community members to come together. And with funding from city government, there are now just very casual outings and concerts in a place that otherwise was just a suburban intersection. And I think what's also really interesting about this project is that it's actually across the street from a library and from a high school. And so you have two civic assets staring at each other, and now there's this amazing public space that is actually designed and built by the community where teenagers, senior citizens, anyone and everyone can come together and have a place to kind of celebrate their community, their neighborhood. The fifth chapter is make public spaces welcoming. Here we see an example of Governor's Island, New York City, but basically inform people from the get-go where they are, be inclusive in your messaging, provide key information and navigation, basically make it intuitive and easy to move through public space. So we want to create welcoming entrances. We want to use positive messaging, as I said, and make navigation intuitive and really elevate someone's understanding of where they are. This is a really fun example of the type of research that we incorporated into our Assembly Civic Engagement Survey. So this is kind of like the highlights at the back, the highlights magazine from our youth growing up. Basically find what's different in the photos. So for those of you who can't make it out, and I can barely make it out from here, in this experiment, we provided a photo to an online survey, and we only shifted slightly the designs between 1 and 2, and people were shown only photo 1 or photo 2. And what we were able to get at that was a little bit of causation, and from that type of research, we were able to determine that simple front porch improvements, as we call them, just incorporating a bench, lighting, some very simple greenery and a sign, can increase the feelings of inclusivity and welcome by upwards of 10%. And these are not expensive investments. We're talking about a light, a planter, and a bench, and a sign. And so that's a pretty pivotal shift positively, just by these simple enhancements. We also looked at a really fun experiment in Charlotte. The You Can signage, Can Do signage project, which when our social scientists, our political scientists started to explore the opportunity here, they were kind of like, I don't think anything's going to change. But they were wrong. By incorporating this signage across the city, there were significant bumps in how people felt in their community as far as pride and trust in local government. And what's interesting here is that this was a pilot program that has now become permanent because it does instill these feelings of positivity about the community and community members. And so just by offering up kind of silly, playful signage versus the kind of standard rules-based, you cannot signage. Chapter 6 is to make public spaces comfortable. Of course, we want to encourage people to come out to public space, but what are the amenities and necessary elements that let them stay in public space? In this chapter, we talk about really providing multiple seating options, not just standard benches, but all kinds of flexible options as well to really empower people to kind of make their own decisions, giving them a sense of agency. We also want to illuminate public spaces and buildings as a way of making people feel safe at all hours of the day. People's schedules are on different times. And so, when they need to go out and run errands or traverse the city or their towns, it's necessary that there be this adequate sense of lighting because that is what is shown again and again to provide a sense of safety and security. We also want to provide water and restrooms. Those are crucial elements to inviting people into public space and also letting them stay. And of course, we want to tailor design. We don't want to do one size fits all. We want to tailor design to local climate. So what are some programs and amenities that can celebrate kind of the uniqueness of a place? And that could be, covering if it's shade stations if it's in a hot locale, or something as simple as campfires we've seen in a couple places, like public fire pits, which is such a neat thing for me because I am drawn to that immediately. Unfortunately, Brooklyn does not have public fire pits. But we know that public seating and civic trust are intrinsically connected. People who report adequate outdoor seating in their community also score higher on multiple measures of civic trust, including, interestingly, a 9% greater satisfaction with police. But also a satisfaction, maybe unsurprisingly, in parks and recreation, but also an increase in public community pride and trust in local government to do what's right and maintain public space. And of course, we see examples of interesting seating from all over the country, but this is just an example from New Orleans, where it's something as simple as just carving out a public parking space, throwing in a few simple seats from IKEA, maybe if there's a woodworker in the room who wants to contribute some ideas, but basically anything that can allow people to just stop and linger and recognize that public space can be used in multiple ways. So what we see again and again across the country, and even in the world, as what these parklets, is that it's really about just piloting an idea and seeing how it sticks. And not all ideas need to be kind of invested long-term permanently, but rather you can just kind of play around with public space. The public right-of-way is definitely a palette on which we can throw ideas. Our 7th guideline is to really make space for activity. In this section, we talk about the need to provide space for programming and events. Programming and events are what makes static public space interesting and exciting. We also really want to support informal interactions. So like I said in the previous chapter, allowing people to seat themselves flexibly can kind of start to encourage different uses of public space. We also talk in this chapter about reclaiming underutilized infrastructure. So whether that's underpasses, old rail yards, any kind of old infrastructure that really isn't serving a public good at this point can be rethought and reused in multiple ways. So we studied this program called GovPorch in Charlotte, kind of through a baseline survey before there was ever any design element thrown at it, and then post. And I'll stop here for just a second and tell the story. So this is a kind of dilapidated public plaza outside of Charlotte's Municipal building. And through a grant from Kaboom, the Play Everywhere Kaboom organization, Charlotte wanted to test some kind of playful ideas about how they could activate this space and bring people to it. And so they put out games and some seating and some balloons and tried to really encourage people to come out. But because of where it was positioned, people didn't really understand what it was. Everyone's coming to the Municipal Center to pay bills, to go to court. You know, it's kind of like everyone's coming together, and there's a real opportunity to elevate the sense of what government's doing for its residents. But what was realized through our research was that only when it was activated through concerts, food trucks, other kind of much more visible elements, did people really start to tick the notch on how they perceived their local government. So I think the lesson to be drawn here, and I think I talk about it on the next slide, is that only through activation are we successful in programming public space. So through activation, there was a 23% increase in the belief that government understands community concerns, a 19% increase in belief that government is responsive to community needs, and a 15% increase in pride of residents in their community. And that's before and after, through some simple, playful, cheap games and the invitation to business to kind of come and activate the space. And finally, we want to foster local democracy. And so what that means, because one of our civic life indicators that really was not as noticeable in the research is informed local voting. And so we want to improve voting access and awareness. We want to increase access to community information. We want to really elevate the visibility of local government. And we want to support community-driven design process. And that's kind of what we feature in this chapter. And we provide a set of strategies that really touch on those elements. And we did a little research around outdoor community meetings and how they can spark additional interest and participation. So what we did is, again, as the same of the front porch improvements photo survey that I featured a few minutes ago, we showed respondents on this online survey only one of these two photos and asked them the exact same question: would you be interested in attending this meeting? And on the left, it's kind of a standard indoor meeting. And on the right, here we have an outdoor meeting taking place in a public plaza. And the increase in very interested in attending the meeting was 21% just by a location change. So I think the lesson to be drawn here is that we should be rethinking where we hold public meetings and how we frame and message inviting people into public meetings as a way of kind of sparking interest. Other sample strategies in this section: increase access and visibility to polling stations, even go so far as hosting a polling party. Those are fun examples we've seen from across the country. We want to make sure that information is widely available to community residents. So through either static kind of information boards, bulletin boards, or even high-tech digital solutions, there's a real need to kind of communicate out information from government. We want to open up public data and make it easy to navigate, so on online platforms. And we want to promote community meetings, as this research has shown. And also importantly, I think it's important to involve the public in any big public process, design process. And looking again to Charlotte, we featured this No Barriers project where there was this park kind of around 4 different neighborhoods of different incomes and races, and they wanted to come together and do enhancements to their park. And so what this kind of taught us was the need to invite everyone in from the onset so that they could encourage and influence the outcome of their public asset. So I want to take just a few minutes and kind of land back to where we started, looking at the Glen Oaks example from Queens. Again, this is the before, and this is the after. And we use this in the back of the guidelines as what we call stories from the field, where there's a lot more information about how this project really incorporates a lot of these different guidelines into a single project. But just looking at this side courtyard, what we have here is this contextual public art. So the neighborhood is one of the most diverse in the country. Over 40 languages are spoken in the zip code surrounding this library. And to recognize that diversity, public art, where the word search was translated into those 40 languages and etched into the glazing of the glass on the outside. So neighbors have really kind of seen this as a place where they can see themselves represented in a public building. There's also, of course, adequate public seating among beautiful greenery that not only serves to mitigate against stormwater, but also really is this public gathering space where one did not exist before. And it can really create and promote a civic dialogue, we think, among diverse user groups. And actually, just anecdotally, we've talked to some of the people who, like that quote before also, that people who use the library now say that it's an incredibly powerful and empowering place to come together and see neighbors and use all of these different amenities, essentially. Also, looking to the interior, there's this welcoming and playful signage kind of hovering above the children's reading section. And it can also, in other places, there's a big welcome sign at the front desk as well that also rolls through community information. There's flexible seating choices that can really address a range of needs and abilities. And there's also this beautiful outdoor reading room that evidence has shown that greenery can really support social interaction. And it also creates a safe space where there are clear sight lines, both in and out, so that you can be in nature and also feel protected by visibility. And also, of course, we know well-maintained greenery can really invite social interaction and improve feelings of civic trust. And so I want to encourage everyone to download a copy because, as I said, there are a lot of great ideas that can really start to move the needle on how we can improve the civic life of our communities, especially here in Sullivan County. So centerforactdesign.org/assembly. I have, in case anyone doesn't want to write it down, I have some flyers to pass out as well. And I'll be leaving a few copies behind as well with the Sullivan Renaissance team. But I want to bring us back to the questions that I posited earlier as a starting point. And I want to open it up to any questions about the research or our process or our guidelines or these. So that concludes kind of the introduction to the guidelines, and I open up to Q&A if anyone's interested.
All right, anybody have any questions for Bryan? If not, I'm going to pick on you. So be prepared. All right, some in the back. Go ahead.
Yes. In your research and your, with increasing civic pride and being more enhanced, where did public policing, fire, EMS personnel come into this, where they would roll up, let's say, on what is the busiest day of that activity area, what's the busiest park, and just have more interaction, improving the trust of all the police, fire, and EMS people?
In our national survey, covering 26 communities, we would task questions out about how people perceived their local police, fire departments, government leaders. But the question is, did we involve them in our process?
Yes. Wouldn't that fit into what you're trying to accomplish here? That have more civic pride, that if you have community leaders and policing that are more involved, have a regular scheduled visits to these different parks and diverse areas.
I see. You're wondering if we asked a question about if there was an increase in policing and or just interactions with police and other community leaders. Was there an associated increase or decrease in pride? I don't know if we asked that question outright. I know that we asked associations about, the survey was primarily based in connecting aspects of the built environment. How far are you from your polling location? Do you have bike lanes in your community? Do you take a car every day? And we asked those questions in association with our measures of civic life. So those for trust, appreciation, stewardship, public voting, or informed local voting. I don't know if we asked the question about direct connections. Lisa, do you know? I don't think so. I don't think that we did. but it's an interesting idea to explore. And again, I want to mention that this is, of course, a first of its kind, pioneering. This is a nascent field, and this is only just scratching the surface of this research. And so there is definitely an opportunity to take those kinds of questions and in phase 2 of this really start to explore deeper connections to civic life and other measures.
Okay, we had another question over here.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, just so we can get.
Happy to use the mic, thank you. I'm on the board of our regional land trust conservancy. And in that conservancy, we try to do a lot of educational programs. It's more along western Sullivan and the Delaware River and parts of Pennsylvania. But the point is that it incorporates this entire area. And we want to do more in Sullivan. We're writing easements all the time, et cetera. We have something called the Shop Local and Save Land program because we have small farms and they're wonderful producers. Many people go to the farmers markets around here and know this very well. But we need to do more of it.
Yeah.
And do more things for the farmers to function better and get more for their products. And the regional programs like Shop Local has to be added to some of these things. I don't even have a clear answer, else it wouldn't be a question, but in some respect, shopping local and supporting your local farmers is just crucial to what we're doing to keep this place rural. If you want it to change into suburbia, it will. But if we want it rural, we have to do something. Thank you.
Absolutely. And in the area where we showcase local food, many of our strategies touch on the need to support farmers markets and activate public space through local markets that incorporate local agriculture as well, and also showcase kind of the variety of local foods. Like the Catskills in Hudson Valley is very agriculture rich, known for its wine, known for all kinds of things. So really kind of hosting these harvest festivals and other kind of specialty festivals around what is regionally unique is absolutely covered in the book.
Did we have a question over on this side of the room? Somebody said there was a hand up. I'm just going, so we can get you on. Sorry.
Thank you.
Next.
Hi, I'm Eugenia. I work at the County Planning Department, and I appreciate your presentation. I thought a lot of the examples were urban and took place in the summer. And if you can talk a little bit about lessons and I suppose how to apply these lessons in a rural context and in the winter.
Sure. In the chapter where we address local climate conditions, we suggest like winter festivals, ice skating rinks. It's interesting. We've heard this before, and I absolutely agree with you that we skew more urban. But the research is representative of the United States of America. We tasked these questions out to communities like Grand Forks, Michigan, or Grand Forks, North Dakota, Milledgeville, Georgia. So the answers and the research that we gathered is representative of small rural communities as well. And I think that a lot of the lessons kind of apply in rural context, connectivity for sure, the need to address climate through greenery and other mitigation measures, definitely the need to create public spaces that bring people together, especially in rural communities where yards and other kind of privatized space can really work against the need to have public space. I think there's even more of a vision needed to create a public space that brings people together when they don't actually need it. So I think a lot of these lessons can be applied definitely in rural areas. To address the climate issue or the cold season issue, it's hard to get people out in the winter. And I would say, as a person who spent a good year trying to find case studies of these projects from across the US, winter festivals and also providing like heating elements in bus stations in cold climates or at transit stations are things that are kind of bubbling up, but it's kind of difficult to determine whole scale what people are doing in rural communities to get people out in the winter. I think that's a great area to explore further. Florida, is that what someone said?
Bryan, early on in the presentation, you mentioned that active participation, you've noticed a decrease in mortality, decrease in crime, increase in income. Have you looked further or deeper into that to see whether it's the economy and the kind of the affluence or the economics of the community that results in the
Which
increase?
comes first, essentially?
Yeah, exactly.
I can't answer that question. I would need to have the full body of research in front of me. I think that is kind of the key question to answer, and I don't know I don't think we've broken that code. But there is definitely a strong associations there, and so what we want to do is posit the idea that let's assume that improving public space can tick those indicators up as far as positive outcomes in communities.
So there's definitely a correlation. Whether there's a cause and effect is still to be determined.
Correct.
Right? Gotcha. Any other questions? Oh, back here.
The library, was that reconstructed or renovated?
Reconstructed.
Really?
And over here? It's just because we're recording this, we want to capture the questions too.
Brian, just a quick question on accessibility. I'm sure you guys touch on that. If you give some examples on some of your projects on accessibility?
As far as ADA accessibility?
ADA, yes.
Absolutely. Our vision for public space is to be open and available to all participants, regardless of age and ability. And I think that by creating public spaces that really support agency and create the sense that everyone is welcome, access via regardless of your language, regardless of your ability to access space, I think that I would encourage everyone to pick up the book and find examples where we do this. And I think that what's really powerful is that, we recognize that there is a need to create valuable public space for everybody. And we want to not only create and design space that does that physically, but also does it through message and inclusion. So messaging, sense of welcome, because not everyone feels welcome in public space. And that is a direct outcome of how public space is messaged. And if you can invite people out and then make it accessible by way of flexible seating, ramps, that's kind of standard design practice, at least from the active design guidelines, and that has been adopted into this as well.
I'm going to pick on Mary Page just for 1 second and then return to questions, because do any of these topics have particular resonance with your work? I wanted Mary Page just to talk a little bit about the renovation of the Crawford Library in Monticello, very similar example to the one in Queens, where the library moved to a new location, had an adaptive reuse, incorporated some public plaza elements, and I know that you have some statistics probably right off the top of your head as a librarian about how library usage has increased over the past 2 years since those improvements were made. Can I put you on the spot? I guess so. No choice.
She didn't say no.
Yeah, well, we're in a much larger space. The physical building is bigger. We have ample parking now, things we didn't have before, and we have an open space alongside the library that we're slowly developing after having designed charrettes when we first had the space. Thank you to Helen for helping facilitate those. So our usage has greatly increased. The building usage, our circulation, surprisingly, has not gone up drastically because libraries are sort of reinventing themselves as spaces for community and safety and just sharing time together. So we've expanded our programming incredibly because we have a space for programming now. We didn't have a space for programming before. We have several spaces for programming. And we actually just met with Helen yesterday about signage for the outdoor space. So seeing that Yes You Can sign, I took a picture of it and sent it to one of my board members because we're all about like, oh, you can't skateboard, you can't do this, you're gonna break your neck, in the parking lot, da-da-da. Please do read a book. And not everybody wants to read a book, and some people are horrified by that, but not everybody wants to read a book, but they can listen to a book, they can watch a movie, they can come share in a program, and use the space community. So I just jotted down I was jotting the whole time, but like for the outdoor space, to try to have some structures that are, indestructible outdoor structures that are somewhat interactive. Because we don't want a jungle gym, we don't want swings, we're not a playground, but, to sort of have some of those kind of elements, because we're doing greenery, we're doing seating, we're actually we have a grant for a stage this coming year, so that'll be even more programming. But it just raises more kinds of questions about how to invite people, but set some parameters for the
course.
use of the space that, you know, are safe, and I'm not like pulling my hair out.
Thank you, Mary Beach. Sorry for the distraction, but I resonated a lot with that slide and the work with the library. So other questions? You're going to make me run back? I'm going to go to you first because you're closer, and then I'll come in the back. So hang on one second.
Hi, I'm John Lockman, and I'm with NPV, and our firm helps towns and villages with planning in the Hudson Valley area. I was wondering if in your case studies, in the active design process when making these civic spaces, whether you found that perhaps initially it was not a success, and how there had to be flexibility to sort of change the design, to adjust things, to get success. Do you have any examples of projects maybe that maybe didn't work that well and then had to be altered in order to get them activated?
Sure. I'm going to honestly answer this question. From an editorial standpoint, we did not want to feature projects that weren't successful. So therefore, I don't have an example off the top of my head, but I'm going to linger on that because I have a spreadsheet back at my office where there are things that had to be kind of rethought out or readdressed as far as the design. GovPorch, absolutely. So GovPorch started out as pure design, and what was noticed was no one was using it. And only through activation and programming did people feel encouraged and welcome to use it. So I think that was kind of a rethink, because as I mentioned, you can only have successful public space if it takes a step further and also considers how people are going to use it and how to actually invite people in.
The reason why I say it is sometimes there's fear in the design process that, or negativity, that won't work. And then if it doesn't, then there's recrimination, and that's an impediment.
Absolutely. Stifles the process. Yeah. We would encourage creativity.
I think we had some questions in the back, and then there was one over here, and then we'll wrap things up. Neil, right?
Thank you. I live in Sullivan County, and I work in Orange County, so I have kind of two different views of things. In Sullivan County, it's much more rural. I think most of us living here, what do we do in the winter? We hunt, fish, trap, snowmobile, ski, whatever. I think that's just what we do here, and I think most of us accept that and probably look forward to that. In fact, many people come from the city to do just that here. In Orange County, we have people moving in from the city who have entirely different expectations. Their children really can't go and play unless we have some kind of organized games at the park. I think there's just a whole different mentality. It seems to be, I don't know if it's evolving or clashing or whatever, but I think we need to look at that in Sullivan County somewhat, because we're going to get that moving up here. Orange County is getting overwhelmed now. Sullivan County is next on the list. So I think the question is kind of where do we go from here? Even when you start talking about bike lanes, well, bike lanes up here would be absurd. Just the miles you'd put in for each house, going from house to house, we couldn't afford it to do it separately. So we need some more guidance, I think, from where do we go from here, where we are now, to where do we go in the future possibly, and take the steps.
I think to explore the what to do next could really open up the question of what should we try to explore next? What should we pilot? What should we being, of course, leaders in the room, representatives of Sullivan County, exploring just opportunities to kind of change the dialogue and change the conversation and explore. Bike lanes may be absurd in some viewpoints, and others may not. I think the middle ground is to just maybe put in a pilot lane and see if people use it, if people feel inspired to use it. We actually use an example from Macon, Georgia, a town of about 60,000 people, so significantly larger than any town in Sullivan County, but still a very auto-dominant. I want to say 97% of people in that community have at least one car in their household. So really trying to change the needle on how perceptions are understood about biking, and what they realized was that people actually did want bike lanes, did use them, and that pilot was actually converted to a full-time network of bike lanes around their downtown. So I think that the lesson to be learned and derived is that just try stuff.
We had another question here.
So my question is on how to attract the residents. how to educate them? Do you advertise? Do you go door to, I mean, if you're in a small town, you can't really engage with your neighbor when they're on 50 acres. You know, I mean, how do you do that?
I think that's the power of creating really compelling public space. So a similar question was raised in Tallahassee, where, and I know that's a completely different place, but there wasn't a singular kind of exciting public space for them to converge. And after they finished this project, kind of on the outskirts of their downtown, the dialogue completely changed because there was now a place where people wanted to get out and explore and be with one another. And I think until you provide that public space or that public amenity, and it doesn't have to be grandiose and large, but basically just a kind of interesting place for people to come together, whether it's a farmer's market or, you know, a 20-acre kind of landmark park. I think that if you give people a reason to come out, again and again, our research reinforces this, if you give people a reason to not only come out but also stay in public, they want to do it. And so I think that to test ideas here in Sullivan County, it is difficult to kind of meet your neighbors in ways other than just seeing them on the street. And I know that necessarily isn't, street life isn't necessarily the way in which people think about meeting their neighbors in more rural communities. But there are, I think, really compelling examples from across the country, from communities of varying sizes, where that has shifted because public space was put in the spotlight.
I think a good example of that is Callicoon Creek Park in Callicoon. That's really a place where people gather, the farmers market, even in the wintertime, and that's a small rural community. Was there other questions over here? I'm going to go to Freda. You already had your chance, Neil. No. I'll come back to you if you're...
And while you're walking, I just really want to quickly address the questions about accessibility in public space. And I was lingering on this question because, you know, I think that's really... It's the mission and kind of the mandate of public space designers to design for everybody. So kind of the ADA is a bit of an assumption, but some of the things that we advocate for in the book itself, strategies that really kind of task out and push that directive a bit further, really prioritizing public transit, alternative transit. A lot of people who who rely on accessible spaces are also enabled to own cars or drive themselves. And so really elevating the frequency and opportunity of public transit and paratransit. Also really creating spaces that offer water and restrooms. I think those are, and what we've seen through research is, you know, having varying height water fountains. Some places don't overlook that fact, but you know, that's absolutely an empowering way to make people feel welcome in public space, especially if they are requiring ADA kind of compliant facilities, and also putting signage about public spaces at the pedestrian eye level and at varying heights as well. So there are these little nuanced ways in which the strategies kind of get at that question without being overt. I can't remember who asked the question. Someone in the back row. Thank you.
Many of your examples came from Charlotte, North Carolina.
Yes.
And I was wondering if you could talk about the environment or background or structural organizational climate that gave rise to them and helped facilitate those things to happen, whether they were part of an organized plan.
Absolutely. They were a key partner in this research. They, from our perspective, are pioneering a lot of interesting ideas in ways that other cities aren't. We also recently had our launch there in June, so we wanted to showcase a lot of the projects that we adopted into the guidelines and into the deck itself for that audience. And I think it's really interesting because it's also the place where maybe I'm being a little biased here, but I also grew up there, so I want to celebrate its successes while also challenging them to do more. This whole body of work was granted to us by the Knight Foundation as an exploration of the connection between civic life and the built environment. And so we also worked diligently in communities that kind of have a Knight footprint. I don't know if anyone's familiar with the Knight Foundation, but they have a kind of cohort of 26 cities across the country where they invest a lot of their time and energy. And so represented heavily throughout the book, and especially in our research, are those 26 communities. But those are not just Charlotte's. Those are anywhere from Philadelphia, Miami, and San Jose, all the way down to, like I said, Milledgeville, Georgia, and Myrtle Beach, South Carolina, all kinds of communities with different topographies, geographies, diverse incomes. I mean, it's really representative of the country as a whole. I don't know if that exactly answers your question, but it was through that partnership and that kind of funding model where we were exposed to these different communities where they were doing all these interesting and exciting things. And Charlotte, again and again, kind of surfaced to the top as far as pioneering interesting ideas and a willingness to pilot projects.
So Bryan is going to stick around for questions and answers, afterwards. We're not going to have a formal break in between the speakers, but both of them will be available afterward if you have any additional questions. So I just want to pause for a second and just thank Bryan for coming out here today.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it. Thanks, Helen.
And again, the Assembly Civic Design Guidelines, you can go to the Center for Active Design website, and you can download those design guidelines for free as a PDF and print them out yourself. There's no charge involved with that. So, yep, and Bryan has some postcards that he can hand out that has the web address and everything. So I'm just going to pause for a moment. I was going to introduce our staff, but I see that a lot of them have kind of gone out in the break area, so we'll acknowledge them before we break up. I just wanted to introduce Karen Black. Karen's our next speaker. She's going to speak about strategic code enforcement and other tools to address vacant and abandoned properties. Karen is a professor at the University of Pennsylvania in the Urban Studies Department, and she's a frequent lecturer throughout the country on the topic of dealing with problem properties. So I hope that.
Sure. Good morning, Sullivan County. My name's Karen Black, and you just saw this amazing presentation on these beautiful active places with lots of color and excitement, and that's not what I'm here to talk about. I'm here to talk about the deteriorated places, the problem properties, the places that once were great, but that might have been 50 years ago, the places that we really don't have a purpose for right now. And I've been doing this work for about 20 years, and I want to start by saying that we know a lot, right? Bryan kind of said this is a nascent area, we're just learning, this is one of a kind. That's not our situation with respect to blight, right? I grew up in Rochester, New York. Everyone's father worked for Kodak, Xerox, Bausch & Lomb, or French's Mustard, and those jobs don't exist anymore. I currently live in Philadelphia, where we lost 1/4 of our population. So picture a city of 2 million that lost 500,000 people and what that looks like. And we still have more houses than households to fill them, right? And I'm working in rural areas around Easton and Bethlehem and Northampton County in Pennsylvania, and there was the slate belt, right? All those blackboards, all that slate we needed, and now we just have empty quarries that are being used to dump waste in, some legally, some illegally. And of course, the big Bethlehem steel site. So for years, I was working primarily in, they're now calling them legacy communities. I actually hate the term, so I shouldn't use it, which means that places that have changed so substantially, their industries, their main businesses, their economic development, that they're looking back at the past, right, their legacy. But with the Great Recession in 2008, I started getting calls from the Twin Cities in Minnesota, from Oakland, California, because they were seeing blight and vacant properties for the first time. And they wanted to learn from us. And that's when I first got this interest in, like, what do we know? Because as all of you know, you can do the same thing over and over without having any real knowledge as to whether it has an impact. So let me start by saying that things have changed tremendously now from 20 years ago. And as I go into cities and towns, let me tell you what I'm not hearing. I am no longer hearing, this is not government's problem. I am no longer hearing, let's wait until the market catches up. The market isn't catching up, right? You have to proactively redefine your markets. I am no longer hearing that people have property rights. They can do whatever they darn well please on their property. Because the reality here is that you can, up to the point it hurts other people, right? I have the right to extend my fist, but only so far as it doesn't hit you in the nose. And since I'm really short, it's more like the stomach. But still, the concept's there, right? And that's really important because that person who has weeds that are 2 foot high and 3 non-working vehicles in their front yard, and you can see the gutters falling off their home, are not just hurting their own property values. They're hurting everyone's around them, right? And that's really important to know. And then finally, I'm no longer hearing of code enforcement like it's a bureaucratic, unimportant function. Code enforcement officials are first responders. They are really, really important. And in every place I've worked, and I just want you to hear this, if you hear nothing else, and I've worked probably in 50 communities, maybe more, I never counted them up. Code enforcement is a profit maker. Code enforcement is self-financing. Code enforcement should not be a burden on government. It also shouldn't be a burden on good property owners who are taking care of their properties. But with things like vacant property registration, right, which Binghamton has and Newburgh has, this idea that if you have a long-term vacant property, you are responsible for registering it with government and registering the plan for how you're going to reactivate it. Because mothballing a property so it harms the whole community is not your right. It violates code. There are things you can do. Okay, so that's the context. This should be a shocking number, and these studies have been done in rural places around the country, but I use this one because I did it, you know, you just have to. So if you are going to make changes in blight in your communities, I would argue that the first thing you need to do is make very clear to all of your elected officials and all government staff that the status quo is not an option. It costs a lot of money to leave blighted properties alone. So for Philadelphia, it costs $20 million every year. That's direct costs. What is that? That's every time the fire department has to go out, every time the police department has to go out. In some of the communities I work in, the deteriorated vacant properties are 30% of the calls. And I hate to tell you, but when you look at firefighter deaths around the country, it is these blighted, deteriorated properties that are most likely the cause. It costs you money, and it brings down the property values for everyone surrounding it substantially. And when it does that, that means less revenue for government in taxes. That means less revenue for school districts. So there's a real cost in not taking care of things. But also the research shows there is this huge upside when you do take care of it. So when you eliminate blight, it reduces crime. And when I'm talking about reducing crime, I'm saying that in jurisdictions that took lots with high weeds, with litter and dumping, and they just got rid of all the waste, they just greened and mowed the lawn, maybe they put a little picket fence around it, that was enough to bring gun violence in that area down 38%. All crime 19%. Why? Part of it is because people are not comfortable committing crimes in places that look well tended. There's other reasons too we'll talk about. It improves the health of residents, right? Bryan talked a lot about what we all need to be healthy, but this is a great study that I really loved. So what they did was the researchers had people stroll by blighted properties. And then they got money, a grant, to fix up those blighted properties, just on the exterior, so they no longer, right, they were all well tended. And then they had the same people walk by them, and they had heart monitors on them. And the reality is that when you're walking down your main street and you're passing a vacant storefront that's dilapidated and deteriorated, your heart rate goes up. Your blood pressure goes up. It happened universally. Even folks who had lived there for long times and had, quote, gotten used to it, Once those places were fixed up, their health improved. And of course, health improves for all the reasons that Bryan talked about, that you want to be in these spaces, you want to be doing things, you want to be active. It raises surrounding property values by up to 30%. 30% on property values is enough to pay towards a retirement, towards your kids' college. If you're in an area that has a lot of dilapidated and deteriorated properties, they are hurting you. Really very specifically, right? And of course, it increases tax revenue. So what we have found that works is strategic code enforcement. And I want to just start there because it is not complaint-driven code enforcement. And that's really important because complaint-driven code enforcement is not as effective, not as fair, and costs a lot more money. So let's just start, Denise started this talking about potholes. So let's assume you're a local government fixing potholes and you've decided on a complaint-driven approach. So you go out, because Ethel called about a pothole, you fill that pothole, you may pass 10 potholes along the way, but you don't touch those, there's no complaint. And then you wait until there's a complaint, and then you go fill that pothole. Right? And your people are crossing the town back and forth, rather than just systematically going through. And that's not fair, right? Because if there isn't an Ethel who's on the phone to her government all the time complaining, then those folks are going to live with potholes. The other problem is, for the average person, it's kind of like not inspecting residents until someone calls with a complaint of food poisoning. Right? You wait until the damage is done, certainly with respect to lead paint, right? Which we know if there is lead paint in a home with small children, and in areas like this with older housing stock, it's there. And if you wait till it's in the blood, then you're talking about a decrease in their IQ, you're talking about a decrease in their behavior, you're talking about an increased chance that they will be involved in criminal behavior, right? Getting to these things quickly really makes sense. So strategic code enforcement is going place to place to place, however many years it takes, and saying these are the basic code requirements. And before you do this, I have to say, what you want to do is educate all the property owners and explain to them why this is important. You aren't out to get them. Explain what the most common and most disconcerting code violations are. When you do this for the first time, you're going to provide warnings. One jurisdiction I worked with started with these formal letters that they were leaving on the porch, which was like, we have found 3 code violations. You must fix them immediately or else, right? And people didn't like that. So they switched to door hangers. And they had pretty door hangers that said, this is a great neighborhood and we want it to be greater. So here's what we noticed about your place. Could you fix it? And if you have questions about how you can get the resources to fix us, call us. And suddenly, there was just this huge response. It should be proactive, systematic. It should include a database of all properties. And this is really important. So many jurisdictions do not know what they have. They don't know how many foreclosed properties are owned by the banks or which bank, right? And we all went through a recession together, and there's a lot of foreclosed properties. They don't know where the vacant properties are. They don't know which properties are being rented long-term. They certainly don't know which properties are being rented short-term as Airbnbs. Knowing who's out there, what they're doing, and what the condition of the property is really important. And once you have it in a database, it's important. The other thing that's really important is that I hear over and over and over and over that even when code enforcement is good and proactive, that the judges and magistrates don't back them up. So you go out there, you say, yep, you violated this, and you bring it to a judge, and they say, yeah, you know, I got more important things. Bigger fish to fry. Once you have a database, then you can actually track all of that owner's properties and bring it to a judge. And we just had a situation, I recommended this to somebody, and they said, we brought their 9 properties in, which were all in terrible shape, because this owner just was waiting for the market to shift. He wanted that windfall. He believed his properties would be worth millions one day, and his way of dealing with it is not investing a cent, just leaving it blighting his community, and then 10, 15 years later, it was going to pay for his retirement. And went before this judge with this whole package, right? And said, here are the 9 properties. And the guy said, Judge, I am poor. I have no money. I can't fix up these properties. I'd like to, but I can't. And the judge said, okay, let's sell 6 of them. Maybe that'll be enough money to fix up the other 3. It changed the conversation, right? And it also changes the culture. And this is really, really important, right? If, in fact, people believe that it is their property to do with what they will, and they are allowed to keep it in any state they themselves feel comfortable with, or some of them have stopped seeing it, right? They don't even notice. Then we've got a problem. And so what we want to do is we want to say, you know what? We are growing this economy. We are improving this community. Come join us. And this is what we're asking you to do, because it isn't acceptable. And almost everything I'm going to talk about for the rest of my time here, quite frankly, is about getting an owner to move from, I'm ignoring you, to how fast do you need me to do it? And that means some very hard things for code enforcement officers, and I know there are some of you in the room. And I have to tell you, you know that door hanger town, a rural town in Pennsylvania called Etna? They ended up contracting out for code enforcement. And the reason why they did that was because their code enforcement person, who'd been in the job for years and years and years, was 70 years old. He knew everyone. And there was no way he was going to cite his cousin. And when they put pressure on him to cite his cousin, he said, I can't do that. Like, I've got to live in this community. And they said, okay, so we're going to do a systematic look at every property's condition, and we're going to hire outsiders to do it. But then you've got to back it up, right? And you've got to tell your cousin. Interestingly, they then brought in the code enforcement guys from outside, and they said, okay, we're going to get you a lot of violations. And they said, no, we don't want a lot of violations. We just want these properties fixed up. That is our goal. And they said, we sent out a flyer saying, you're going to be coming, and this is what you're going to be looking for. The guy said, no. Then they'll improve things before I get there. And they said, this isn't the code enforcement guy for us either, right? We want them to improve things. We aren't trying to penalize anybody. We want action. So what I have found is there is no one magic bullet to deal with blight. If there was one tool that would fix everything, that would be fantastic. But there isn't. So in Pennsylvania, I created a book that basically sets out every tool that's legal under state law, who's using it, how they're using it, in what situations. And I'm hoping to do one for Delaware very soon. But the idea is to learn from other communities under the same legal framework as you, and to know what the cost is. And that's really important, because to say pie in the sky, go out to every single property, how are you going to fund that? It's really important to know. And the first thing is to have a law in place. If you do not have a law that says it is illegal to keep 3 non-functioning automobiles in your front yard, then you cannot use code enforcement. You need to have a law. And the International Property Maintenance Code, which is updated every 3 years, is a very good one. It only deals with the exterior of homes, and it deals with all of those things that make a place look terrible, that attracts rodents and other vermin, that cause trouble. And it also creates a list of fines and penalties for those who do not take care of their properties. And this is really important. And then I would argue there's two categories of tools. So the first are, like, we want to know about every property in our communities, what condition they're in, who owns them, what they've done, what they have the capacity to do, and what they need. And then we're going to try to help, and we'll talk about some things to help and incentives, and we're going to enforce. But then there are those property owners who are not going to do what you tell them to do. And it does not matter if you have the law in place. And in places that I work, they will say, if you have 3 code violations, it is a criminal misdemeanor and you will spend a year in jail. Whoopee. No one has ever spent a year in jail. No one has any expectation that they will spend a year in jail. So it's irrelevant, right? How many people here are parents? Okay? How many of you have said to your kid, if you do that, you are going to your room until you go to college, right? And yet it's dinner time and you call them down to the table, right? That threat has absolutely no meaning. So it's about having a law, but it's also about making clear and enforcing that law. And in one jurisdiction where they used a hall of shame, have you guys heard of the hall of shame? I kind of like this. So what they would do is they would feature a property owner who had a series of really, really bad properties, kind of the worst of the worst. And the newspaper worked with them and the local TV station. So suddenly, Sal is front page of the paper. He's being featured as the worst slumlord, the worst property owner, right? And before that happens, they say, Sal, we just want you to know, we've been asking you now for a year to fix this up. And the paper just asked us for the worst property owner who's harming our area the most, and we sort of had to give him your name. So will you work with me to fix him up? And then Sal says, no, right? And whenever they did that, what they found was Sal was a lost cause at this point, because now Sal had undergone all that bad publicity. But they got a dozen phone calls from property owners going, you wouldn't do that to me, would you? What do I need to do today to make sure that you never do that to me, right? It changed the rules. It changed the culture. There was accountability. There has to be accountability if you have long-term properties that are not being cared for, because as communities, it's time to say we will not accept that blight and vacant properties are just part of our communities and we have to accept it. The reality is we don't. So where enforcement fails, you need to have other tools. And New York has several of these tools, and it does not have others. And so part of it is knowing what tools you can use under state law, and part of it is adding laws. So let me just give you some examples. Asset attachment. In Pennsylvania, if you have liens on your property, if you have code violation penalties, you are personally liable for them. What does that mean? That means that when you have a very, very nice house that you take care of, and yet you've left your mother's house that was willed to you in terrible condition, paid no mind to it, that we can say, hi, we're going to actually take the value from your other house in order to pay for all those liens and all those years we've been mowing and caring for the property you didn't take care of. We can also get your wages. We are saying you are personally responsible. Eminent domain, Cumberland County in Pennsylvania, very similar to the area around us, different industries. They decided to bring 100 eminent domain claims. Now, eminent domain, for those of you who have been, it is a painful legal process. You're taking someone's property from them. It takes forever. So, and it's costly. So why did they do this? Because no one was paying attention and they needed to change the culture. They brought 100 condemnation actions, 100 eminent domain actions. Guess how many settled? 95. They either sold the property to someone else because they didn't want the headache, or they fixed it because they didn't want to risk losing the property and it had value to them. The other 5 out of that 100, they had to go through the whole process. And it was expensive, but not when you divide it by 100. And no one is messing with them anymore, right? They've proven that it's valid. Conservatorship or receivership, really important, this idea that a government doesn't have to take liability for property. The court can appoint someone who's going to fix it up and get paid back because they're either going to rent that property out or sell it. And land banks are springing up all across the country, certainly all across New York. They absolutely fit my mantra of there is no magic bullet, but they can be so helpful. Because one of the things we're seeing with blight around the country is it's no one's job. Blight is not the fire department's job. It's not the planning department job, right? It really starts escaping notice until the problem gets worse and worse and worse. So having a land bank that does 2 things. 1, it's their job. And 2, they take control of the land and make sure it goes from a bad actor to a good actor. And that may seem simple, but in most of our communities, most of the properties that are taken for lack or failure to pay taxes. And when you put foreclosed properties into the system and bring them to tax sale, and they go to other bad actors, you haven't achieved anything. In fact, most of them will cycle back through foreclosure and back to tax sale. And we've looked at places across the country, and there's good research to show that's what happens. That the people who are bidding for them are not the people who have the capacity and interest in reactivating them. And so now you've taken a property from a bad actor who's blighted your community. You've gone through a whole process. The high bidder at auction takes it. They leave it in bad condition until it becomes foreclosed again. And then you're into cycle 3, and it's harming the community again and again. Land banks stop that cycle. They also can assemble land into developable sites, which is really critically important when you've got one property here, one property there, one property there, if you want to really deal with this at scale. And it is really important, we found, to bring everybody together. So this kind of gathering is so important because it isn't someone's job. And so if you bring the judicial system and the public safety system and community stakeholders together and they're all going to work together on it, you have so much better chance of being successful. The other thing that really increases your chance of success when dealing with problem properties or blight is to target the worst of the worst. Be strategic. Those communities that have basically thrown funding at properties like seeds, hoping for them to grow, have not been successful. We've looked at that. If you say, I have 100 properties I would like dealt with, and I have very few resources, but I'm going to try to deal with all of them, it doesn't work. So you pick the first 5, and you put all your weapons that you have at your disposal to try to get those properties back in good condition, reactivated, not harming anyone around them. And when you're successful, then you move on to the next 5 properties. But it's very, very important that you have a focus. The other thing we found is that the cheapest, most effective way to deal with a property that is blighted is to deal with it when the owner wants something from you. Okay, all these people who are parents in the audience, if you tell your teenager to take out the garbage when they are watching, in my case, an Eagles game on television, what is the chance that they will immediately get up and take out that garbage for you? Yeah, Ma, got it, later. That's not the time to ask. When they come and they say, can I have the car? And I say, can you take out the garbage? That garbage is out of there so quickly, right? They want something from me. And by the way, I don't waste those moments on just garbage, right? There's some room cleaning. There's big projects to be done. Same with owners. When they come to you because they want something, this is your moment. So permit denial. If they come to you because they want to put a nice deck on their beautiful house, but they have 3 blighted properties that they've assembled that are just, they haven't put any investment in, you say, no, sorry, we can't give you the permit until all of your properties are code compliant. It works. Pre-sale inspections, very, very helpful with out-of-state owners. You know, it's very hard to get at owners who you don't have jurisdiction over, right? You aren't going to get your governor to prioritize it and get them brought into town in handcuffs. It just doesn't work. But when they want to sell something and you say, before you sell it, you need to have an inspection, list all the problems for the buyer so they know what's facing them, or fix them so that you are only selling code-compliant properties. That is an opportunity. And then registration. I talked about how Newburgh and Binghamton have this. This idea of, yeah, I know, it was a gas station. Yep, tanks underground, expensive. Hear ya, fine. This is a long-term vacant property. What is your plan? And what is your timeline? And San Diego was the first one to do this. And what happens is people actually respond and they start thinking. And they're also told that there's going to be consequences if they do not. Now, vacant property registration has been upheld in courts across the country because property owners have brought it to the courts and said, you can't charge me just because it's a vacant property. I am a property owner. I have the right to do whatever I want with my property. In this case, I want to do nothing and just let it fester and become an eyesore and hurt all of my neighbors. And the courts have said, no, you don't. Local government has an extraordinary power to address blight. Really important. So once you register, so Binghamton and Newburgh do fairly small amounts of money each year to register vacant properties. Minneapolis, a court just upheld $6,000 per year per vacant property. That's how much you have to pay. Why? Because government showed that they're mowing those properties, they're going to deal with vermin on those properties, they have huge and significant costs to address them, and code enforcement should be self-financing. The properties that are costing local government money should pay. And before you say this idea of systematically going, right, from house to house and commercial property to commercial property is impossible because there's too many, I would say that there are not. That very large cities have taken 5 to 7 years, but they've gone to each and every one, put them in their database, and they now understand who's a renter, who's a homeowner, which properties are vacant, and they can take the appropriate action to make sure the conditions of each help the community, don't harm the community. So in doing so, right, Sacramento, from 2008 to 2013, they had a team of code enforcement officers 3 days a week going from property to property, right? These are rental properties, and they were going inside. But they reduced dangerous buildings by 22%. Greensboro, North Carolina, where I'm going back to in a couple weeks, they reduced their housing complaints by 61% and brought all their properties up to code. I also want to talk about Philly, my hometown, for a second, because, and I'm a lawyer by training, I should say that, so I really love when owners bring these cases to court and you have a court ruling and saying, yep, you can do that. Makes me feel much more comfortable, much more confident. So Philadelphia, at one point, had 60,000 vacant properties. Talk about scale, right? 60,000. And their argument was that everyone had to board up those properties. And most people use plywood, and then government would have to go out over and over because somebody would pry off the plywood. And, you know, talk about the curb appeal. of a commercial property that you're walking by with plywood just in the doors. So Philadelphia very strategically said, we have to change the culture. And they came up with this idea. They said every single structure has to, with blocks that have at least 80% occupancy. So these are not, Philly has some shelled out areas where nobody's living. But 80% occupancy, you have to put in working doors and windows because we think that's going to make a difference. And for every day you don't do that, we're going to charge you $300 per opening. So if you picture a Philly row house for a second, they typically have 6 openings. 3 windows up top, 2 windows on the bottom, 1 door. That's $1,800 a day. And it keeps adding up. Now, again, Philly's goal was not to collect that money. And it certainly wasn't to penalize the owners. It was to stop them from saying, I'm going to ignore you, and get them to say, how fast do you need me to move? And it worked. And it worked really, really well. And what the court did is they established their own, what the city did, established their own blight court. And that just basically meant taking one magistrate and assigning them 1 day a week only to these cases. And the courts agreed to do that. So it's called blight court, but it's really an assigned judge. And what they found was that long-term vacant structures, the owners fixed them up, increased their prices by $74 million. I know this is a different scale, but it's an important scale. Increased tax revenue for the city by $2.34 million. Reduced gun violence, and provided fees to fund the whole process so it was self-financing. And last week, the court decision came down and they said, of course the city can do that. Property owners do not have the right to stick plywood on their properties and say, yep, I've done my part. It affects health, it affects safety, it affects the community. So I want to talk for 2 seconds about problem properties and then 2 seconds about owner-occupied properties and talk about my passion project, which I think can really work in communities to deal with property owners who really care about their property and want to fix it up but don't have the resources. And then I'm going to open it up for questions. So problem rental properties, there are several ways to deal with them. I talked about vacant property registration, but rental property registration is important too, right? Rental properties are a business. They need a business license. They need to register. It's really important to know where your tenants are and what kind of conditions they're living in. So there are 4 types of registration, and I'm for the last one. So we're going to ramp up and I'll tell you what it is. So the first is you just ask owners to register. Tell us if you're a landlord and you're renting out a property. The second is do that, but also we are going to regularly inspect. And the third is we are going to give you a rental license. You register with us, we are going to give you a rental license, and we have the ability to take away that license if your property has substantial code violations and you have not addressed them. It is not just your right to be a landlord. And then the final one is that you actually use that little database, which can just be an Excel spreadsheet from all those code enforcement reviews, and you actually say, we're going to treat you differently if you're a good landlord than if you're a bad landlord. And what it does is it says, first of all, you know who your landlords are. You can get them in a room. You can send them something and say, guess what? The law changed. Or guess what? We're really concerned about this. Or guess what? We are giving away free recycling bins. Or guess what? We're having a training. It improves the communication back and forth. And you can provide different incentives and rewards for landlords as well as penalties. And it's really important when you're doing this to do 2 things. One is not punish the good landlords. Don't impose huge fines, fees, whatever, or requirements, and make it really cost effective for government because, right, we've got limited resources. So automating things and making it easy. We're going to talk about that, outsourcing it. But this should not be, this isn't rocket science. Communities have been doing this now for decades. I can get you an Excel spreadsheet that shows what you're checking off. We have the information, we know how to do this. And the idea is that you actually can adjust the inspection schedules depending on the type of property and the type of property owner. So, what does that mean? It means that you treat people differently, but you do it legally because the state of their property is different. Code enforcement officers have been shown to waste half of their time. Code enforcement officers waste half of their time going to good properties. You get rid of that waste by knowing which are the properties that need constant supervision and which ones don't. And Minneapolis has this, but Brooklyn Center is a more rural area outside of Minnesota, outside of Minneapolis in Minnesota. And what they do is they rank their landlords on their properties. And for those in number 4 who are in the worst shape with tons of code violations, they're going to go in every 6 months. They're going to mandate that they get involved in training, and they're going to mandate that they create and give to government an action plan to take care of them over time. For the good ones, they can actually hire an inspector themselves, or you can say, hey, we're just going to come in every 4 years just to make sure things haven't gotten out of control. Again, if there's no complaints, right? Because you can still complain. Okay, and then incentivize the good landlords as much as you can, because we want good landlords, we want good property owners. It's been really, really effective, and I have to say in dealing with rental properties, being creative is important. In the same week that the courts in Pennsylvania said that the windows and doors program was legal, they also came down with a decision about an owner, property owner, who tried to evict a tenant, but he wasn't registered with the city as a landlord. He hadn't paid any of the fees, he hadn't done anything. And the court said, you can't use my court to evict a tenant because you aren't legally a landlord. Guess those registrations are going up, right? In Seattle, they said you can't increase rents if you have quality of life code violations that affect health and safety. Just can't do it, right? So again, it's about getting their attention. It's about changing the culture. It's about letting folks know there are consequences. Now, owner-occupied properties are very different because you cannot go into a homeowner's property without a warrant. But you can absolutely deal with the exterior. And, you know, I told you that Brian's pictures were gorgeous and mine were not. Ta-da! Right? But you've seen these properties, right? You drive by them and you're like, oh my God, what a mess, right? So by changing the culture and letting them know that this isn't okay, you'll find there is some voluntary compliance. You also know that there's going to be consequences because you've changed that culture, and you may need to have some incentives. Now, what folks in Pennsylvania have done that has been very effective is quality of life ticketing. What they do is just like you get a ticket for parking your car in the wrong place or at the wrong time, or you'd swear it was the right place and the right time, but you still got a ticket. Quality of life ticketing is when the inspector goes, they don't take you to court, they leave you a ticket and say, we noticed that your gutters are detached. We noticed that you aren't mowing your lawn. This is your warning. Next, we'll be back, and at that point, there's going to be a fine, and just escalate things. And what folks like Cole Township in North Cumberland found was they provided tickets that kept increasing, and they got, Allentown got 60% of the tickets paid, Cole Township got about 85% of the tickets paid, and they got them paid because there's also some peer pressure, right? Well, you don't want to be the property owner who doesn't take care of things because everyone knows, right, that they got ticketed. They had these beautiful neon pink tickets. And I know this has been violated and used badly in New York City, but nuisance properties really do need to be addressed to abate the nuisance, and the law allows you to do that. And I can talk about that more if folks are interested. But I want to end with a real positive note around the Healthy Row House project, which is my passion project that I've been working on for 4 years, and I think can be very helpful. So in my hometown of Philly, we have a really robust home repair grant program. The demand is here, the supply is here, right? Every year, the city runs out of money for home repair grants right around March. And then you got to wait, right, for the next year. And the average person is waiting on the home repair list for 4 years, right? Picture a dime-sized hole in the roof and then waiting 4 years, right? By the time they get there, you've got enough water in the house that it's affecting the electricity, that there's mold growing on the walls that's affecting the asthma of children living there. You've got a problem, and probably the viability of the home. So what we did was we said, look, home is everything, right? And we really need to protect our affordable housing stock because these homes are old, but if an old home is tended to, it can last centuries, right? And so we said we can't afford to lose the existing homes. People are relying on them. And there's a whole bunch of studies, I could show you another 15 slides, but I won't, showing that for seniors, it means they're going to die sooner. For children, it means that they may not be breathing, or they may not be able to think, or they may, right? It all affects how you live, and it affects the healthcare industry because they can't even discharge a patient because they don't have a safe place to go to when they go back home. And so what we did is we looked at who needed the home repairs and who was getting them. And what we found in our city was that in 2 years, 24,000 homeowners applied to banks, private market lenders, for home improvement loans, and 67% were turned down. They wanted to get the capital, they couldn't access the capital, and the main reason was their credit scores. Sometimes their income, but their credit scores. So what we did was we encouraged Philadelphia, and we've had some success, to create a loan guarantee program where the city guarantees that the loan will be paid back, and said to the lenders, right now you're only giving money to folks who make 660 credits, who have credit scores of 660 or above. We want you to go down to 580. And in doing so, you're going to open up credit and capital to 25% of Philadelphia homeowners who can't get it now. 25%. We stole the idea, I love stealing ideas, from Cleveland Heights, Ohio. Now, Cleveland Heights was outside of Cleveland. You know, Cleveland isn't doing too well. Cleveland Heights wasn't doing too well. They struck an agreement 40 years ago with Key Bank. They said, we're going to put a certificate of deposit, a CD, in your bank for $160,000 to guarantee any loan that you give to our homeowners. And after 40 years, that has actually produced over $6 million of loans, and the default rate has been 6%, and virtually everyone who has defaulted has died. So you know you can't blame them. I'm just saying, they would have rather paid. Detroit just started an $8 million loan program with Bank of America, and they went down to 560 credit score, were much more generous about income levels, and they have less than a 1% default rate. So this idea of if folks can, in fact, take out a loan, right? If you want to take out a $10,000 loan at 3% interest, which is what Philly agreed to, it's about $99 a month. If they have that in their budget, and some don't, I absolutely understand, some need grants, it's a really extraordinary tool to basically make sure they have access to the capital they need. So, talk tough, change culture, follow up, offer some financial incentives. And what I'm finding is it makes an incredible difference. It changes the neighborhood, it changes the environment, and you would be amazed at how responsive new businesses are because they see it as a sign that they should come in, new residents, and everyone feels better for all the reasons Bryan talked about we want to be in good places that are well tended and well cared for. So thank you.
Are we working now? Yay, thank you. Okay, questions? Come on.
I have one specifically around blight that are caused by major storms. That's something that I know the community that I worked in, when there were major storms, a lot of trees down. The town was not addressing it. It was kind of like deal with it yourself. But there were folks in particular, seniors living in the community that just can't. And so they would kind of put it out by the road. It's now been there for about 6 months. Probably isn't going anywhere. Are there strategies you would recommend for things like that where either the government can get involved or grants that are available to address those issues?
So it's really interesting. Great question. So most of the places I work in, it has been a slow boil. Blight has been occurring over 50 years and increasing over time. When we were looking for solutions, we looked at disaster recovery, right? Because that's the very opposite thing, which is, whoop, one storm knocks out everything. How do you get it up and running? And we did that in order to try to get it to scale. And so this loan program that I just told you about called the Healthy Row House Project, it is going to have 20 different contractors. It is going to have the ability to go into 20 homes at a time. It's going to have teams. It is going to start fixing up houses as if it was a disaster, if that makes any sense. But at the same time, when disasters happen, whether you think the federal government is responsive or not, you have just unlocked a whole series of new resources. And so the places that have had major disasters tend to be able to get help from FEMA, tend to be able to get some help if they are insured or not. And traditional blight that happens over time, you can't. I can tell you that there are communities that have suffered major, major losses, and they're talking about maybe never recovering. Some communities in North Carolina, 2 years ago, everything was wiped out. They were still in the process of constructing it. And so tools, right, these tools really are about creating more responsible owners and better properties. And you can't do that with these tools if there's a disaster. You actually need the National Guard to come in, the resources to come in to fix it. Would that folks agree? Does that make sense?
Okay. Additional questions? Don't make me pick on you.
Hey, I have an observation.
Oh, we'll get him
You
first.
touched on some, I'd rather not.
Okay.
I think you touched on some very sensitive issues. The reason the towns or the planners have failed the community to create the depreciation of properties and the vacancies leans toward the government, the local politics, and the planners that have allowed their community to degrade to a level where investors that own rental properties no longer have the potential to have a decent income or to have the monies to improve the properties. So by applying rules, regulations, fines, and demanding they fix properties that have no potential for income seems to be a little abrasive to me. And at the same time, it's kind of contradicting because the community needs to rise up and grow and not necessarily attack people that own properties that have declined because the community or the state failed them. I mean, people didn't just leave Philly because there was some sort of blight going around. I mean, the community failed them. I mean, the job opportunities left, income potentials. I think that that's a big, big issue.
So this was a really good point, which is the community, the government, hasn't really taken any action. all this time, and as a result, all the property values are depressed, and the interest in renting properties are depressed, and the visitor levels are depressed, and now you're going to go to an owner and say, yep, your property is barely profitable, but we want you to make all the investments, and is that fair? Or is that abrasive? And, you know, in the law, right, law school, there's the reasonable man standard, right, which is what would a reasonable man do in this situation, right? Would they jump out of a moving train? Because now they're suing the train company because they broke their leg on the way down, right? And the court would say, no, like a reasonable person doesn't do that, but a reasonable person does try to get into the train doors just before they close, and when their leg is cut off in doing so, well, the train is liable, right? What is reasonable, what isn't reasonable is really, really important. And for this situation, the reality is that there has to be a culture shift. And yes, it would be great to turn the time machine back and always hold owners to standards, and hold them to standards when it wouldn't have cost that much, because things were just starting to fall apart, things were just starting to deteriorate. But the whole idea of this kind of performance measure, gradation, treating owners differently, giving them lots of warnings, is to not be punitive. To not say, you know what, every single thing in the code has equal importance. You cannot put a broom on your front porch because a broom doesn't belong there, it says so in the code. Who cares if there's a broom on the front porch? But if there is basically 18 garage sales worth of stuff on the front porch, that's something worth dealing with. And you aren't asking people to deal with it today. You're asking them to give you a plan for how they're going to deal with it over the next few months. And you're trying to help. And communities have been really, really amazing, the resources they found for hoarders, because that's a big problem, people who hoard internally, externally. There are communities all over the country that have community colleges that have geriatrics programs that are working with seniors that go out and help them make these small repairs. There are programs to make the house accessible so that when seniors end up in a wheelchair, they can access everything. And the cost is not that high, right? For $2,400, you can make a home accessible. For $1,000, you can take a terrible, gross, disgusting vacant lot full of stuff and turn it into a little parklet and an asset for the community just by planting grass and a few plants and getting rid of the stuff. And you know what? They don't dump again. Once it's tended, the neighbors, the people who would come and make a mess don't, because it's a well-tended area. So finding these things, we're also working with healthcare to get them to finance some of this, because the healthcare industry benefits greatly when patients with chronic disease like respiratory illness don't have to be readmitted, because Medicare and some others, they can't get repaid for that. And so to take care of a child who can't breathe and keeps coming to the emergency room isn't going to help if in fact their house has mold and black spots all over and carpeting that's making them ill. So going in and for a few $100s ripping that up, getting rid of the mold, repainting, the studies show, this, I'm not making this stuff up, this is real. You can increase their school attendance by 200%. You can decrease their emergency room visits by 75 to 85%. And that's not a lot to do. And it is not going to resolve every code violation. And this Healthy Row House project, we had to get the city to agree that if somebody got a loan to fix their roof, they weren't going to go in and say, okay, I'm inspecting everything, and you have knob and tube wiring, and that's illegal, and you're going to have to spend $35,000 fixing your electric system. So all of this is to say, not one answer, not draconian enforcement, but you know what? You got to say, this isn't okay. We have to change it, because if you don't, nothing is going to change. And you've got some great tools like the land bank to take the worst of the worst and then help some of the other folks along until every main street and every residential area is one that I want to go move into with my children. because this place is gorgeous, right? You just have these beautiful, beautiful communities and such natural beauty. And it's just getting control and saying, property owners, you actually have an obligation. And the difference that that can create is remarkable.
As it falls under the category of you got to start somewhere, right?
Yes, you do.
We had a question here.
You talked a bit about banks cooperating with some of these programs. What do you do with banks' foreclosed properties? I happen to have lived next to one 10 years ago, and this bank, we offered to buy it. And it was like, oh, it's being managed by someone. They seem happier to just sit on these things and let them rot than move them. How do you deal with that?
Okay, so jurisdictions have done great things in that regard that have had huge impacts. So one is foreclosure registration. So there are several companies, Safeguard is one of them. I should probably say at least 2 or 3 others, so I don't seem to favor one, but I can't think of them at the moment, where they get the information from the bank, and then they send a bank notice on your behalf. They take half of the foreclosure registration fee to do this, but it's all privatized, and they say to the bank, in our community, when you have a foreclosed property, we expect you to take care of it, and this is what we expect from you. We want you to mow it. We want you to take care of it. We want you to get rid of all the plywood. We want you to turn off the water. We want you to deal with the pool that's a hazard, and all of these things. And it's self-financing, right, because of foreclosure registration. We've also found that banks do not have as big an appetite as they used to for owning properties in all of these communities. And so negotiations one-on-one have made a difference, and there are 2 national organizations that will help you negotiate, and we can talk about that. But the idea is to get them into something like a land bank where you can say, hey, here is a property, or even better, in the hands of a developer or a homeowner who will turn that property into an asset. But banks have really turned a corner because the press was so bad, and because the worst of the properties we call zombie properties, because they foreclosed, the owner left thinking that they had lost the property, and they never completed the foreclosure process. So now they don't own it. The owner doesn't think they own it. No one's ever going to fix it, and in 3 decades we're going to be talking about that property. That can't be the case, right? Once you have all your properties that have problems into an Excel spreadsheet, you'd be amazed at the tools you can use to address each one. But first you need to know what kind of property, what its problems are, and who owns it. And then you can find the right tool to make a difference.
Very good. Additional questions? Oh, Jill, you're going to make me run, aren't you? All right, watch me. No, it's again, the microphone is not necessarily for you guys to hear. It's for us to pick up on the recording.
Hi, Karen.
Hi.
I have a question. We had a housing roundtable yesterday where we talked about one of our biggest needs was substandard rentals and going after it. So the rental inspection database would be great. Do you find that there's a transition or a concern of if you're starting to now condemn some of these properties and pushing these tenants out, that they don't have a place to go to live because there's no other good housing available?
Okay, this is really important. So Detroit is the outlier, right? Detroit has the worst of the worst, right? They had a single industry that went out of business, basically, and they have so much vacancy, it's incredible. And they decided just this year to start inspecting rental properties. And they did not make any attempt to allow tenants to stay for some period of time if they revoked that landlord's license. And as a result, there's been some displacement, and we don't know how much, but I'm actually talking to them to try to get those numbers because I think that's a problem. What other places have done is they have said, if you are in violation, first of all, you have 6 months before we will fully revoke your license. And we're going to come in after 3 months and see that you've addressed all the safety and health things. And then at 6 months, if this is a place that is unsafe and unhealthy for these tenants, we are going to try to help find them other places to live. Because that's the worst of the worst. And as I say, I've been doing this work a long time, and I went to UCLA Law School, and my first case was against a slumlord. And he had 300 units. And when I said, well, let's go after him, they said, no. You go after him, and you're going to have 300 households who don't have a home. And that was, I don't want to tell you how long ago law school was, but a long time ago. And what ended up happening was this landlord was told that he was on the way to losing all his properties, all 300 units. And that was made really, really clear. And he did fix them up. Now, were they gorgeous housing? No. But they were safe for folks to live in. Another thing I've got to tell you is what Dallas did, which was really effective, and I don't know if it would work here, so you guys have to tell me, but I really liked it, which is when Dallas started enforcing the code against rental properties, they collected the worst of the landlords, like the folks who had several properties in bad condition. And the mayor invited them to come meet him in his office and said, you know what? We are fixing up our housing because we know it's making our people sick, because we know it's hurting our economy, because we know it's hurting our neighborhoods. Will you join the mayor's team? I'm sure he did it better than I did, right, because he's a politician. And only one landlord said no. And to join the mayor's team and be on the landlord advisory committee, he just had to deal with each of these code violations. And it was an interesting carrot because suddenly they were invited to places, right, as, ooh, this is a good landlord. And all they had to do was become a good landlord to do it. And that was enough motivation for them. So carrots and sticks.
Did they also get matching T-shirts? Because that probably would have helped too.
T-shirts always help. T-shirts always help, or a little swag here and there. Yeah.
All right. Any other questions? Otherwise, I'm going to close by picking on Bryan. So, Bryan, could you talk a little bit about the Town of Liberty? Because the Town of Liberty has contracted. Oh yeah, all the other Bryans in the room were like, "Oh crap." So Liberty recently made a switch to contracted code enforcement and has had some success in dealing with the issue and cooperating between the town and the village. And I just wanted you to maybe share some of your experiences really quick.
Sure. Well, first of all, yeah, the town contracted with a private engineering firm, and our Al Fusco from Goshen was here earlier, and so he has, a bunch of professionals that perhaps more manpower than a single code enforcement officer could accomplish here in Liberty. So that was before my time, so I certainly can't, comment on the whole progression of it. But just like any code enforcement officer, they have their limitations too. There's a lot to do up here. But I think what it did bring to the table was a higher level of expertise and being engineers and such. So that has helped. But more exciting was a program we put together this year with the Village of Liberty, and Pam Winters, the code enforcement officer from the village, is here. And I want to say hello to her and thank her for her cooperation in this. And that the Town of Liberty and the Village of Liberty reached an agreement that allowed the Town of Liberty code enforcement people to cite violations in the Village of Liberty. And our focus was on Main Street this summer, and it was part of our Renaissance program, and we thank the Renaissance people for encouraging it and helping fund it. And Fusco actually donated money to do this as well. And the idea is to, really to hit on the low-hanging fruit, the obvious code violations that we saw on Main Street, and just like an intensive effort to try to get people's attention, try to get these things changed quickly to give, as much visual appeal as we can on our street. So, so far, I think we have 16 cases in court I believe, from that effort that may not have been there otherwise, because as terrific as Pam Winters is, I mean, she's very overtaxed with handling the village single-handedly, which is quite a challenge. So in addition to what Pam has done, and she has done a lot, she has a lot of cases in court, but the town has now added 16 more cases in court. Not that court is the only answer. We want to do a lot of these other nice fluffy things, and we're all for that. But right now we're in the trenches trying to get people's attention. So that has been, a real, we're not seeing overnight success with it, but it's something we're hoping will catch on, and it's above, if nothing else, it's municipal cooperation, which is unique, right? Anyway, thank you, Helen.
Thank you. All right. If there's no other questions, can we give Karen a big round of applause? I want to thank both of our speakers for coming out here today. Hopefully you learned a little something. I want to do just a quick plug for Sullivan Renaissance. As Bryan mentioned, a lot of people view Sullivan Renaissance as the flower police, right? We're the people that are out there, giving people money to plant flowers. But we're more than just that. The programs that I manage are really geared towards municipalities, and we offer grants to incentivize some of the things that Bryan and Karen talked about here today. So if you have an idea for a project to enhance a public space, if you need additional personnel to maintain your public spaces, if you need to buy software to start a database of problem properties, if you need additional help, we have grants that can help municipalities tackle beautification, maintenance of public spaces, healthy communities, and code enforcement. So talk to me later if you have an idea, because we're now gearing up for our 2019 funding round. So I just want to close by saying I know a lot of the ideas that you heard here today from both speakers are much larger in scope, geared towards urban environments, but take some of that information back with you, see how it could apply in your own communities. And as a wise man who is seated in the room here today but shall not be named once said, think big, start small, do something. So thank you.